And so we carry on now our thoughts through the Gospel of John, looking at the theme of Jesus is not God. And we're now on to John chapter 17. This is a chapter that tells us a great deal about the nature of Jesus, and it tells us that Jesus is not God. For some context as the background of the chapter, this chapter is one long prayer that is given by Jesus just before his betrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's just after the Last Supper. He's on his way to the garden where he knows that he's going to be betrayed, he's going to be arrested, he's going to be put on trial, he's going to be falsely accused, he's going to be beaten, he's going to be tortured, he's going to be put to death in the extremely unpleasant way of crucifixion. So Jesus knows that all of these things are about to happen to him in the next few hours. He's going to suffer horribly and he's going to die. And so what we have here is Jesus's innermost thoughts when he knows he's about to die. And when a person knows they're about to die and they have their innermost thoughts, and we can see their innermost thoughts, it tells us an awful lot about their character. So this chapter really does reveal a great deal about Jesus's character, what he was like as a person, his emotional state at this time. And there's a great deal you could learn from this chapter about Jesus. We are, of course, due to the theme, going to be focusing specifically on Jesus not being God and how his nature in that sense is brought out through these verses. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to go through the entire chapter. It's not very long. We're going to read it together and I'm going to bring out some of these key points, some of these key verses as we go along that just emphasize to us that Jesus is not God. Jesus is the Son of God. So let's dive straight in. Verse 1, when Jesus had spoken these words, he lifted up his eyes to heaven and said, Father, the hour has come, glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you. Immediately, it's worth pointing out, this whole chapter is a prayer. Jesus is praying to God. That is inherently not a thing God does. God does not pray. God does not pray to God. God has no God, but Jesus does. Jesus is in prayer here. He is praying to God because Jesus is not God. And he says, Father, the hour has come, glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you, since you have given him authority over all flesh to give eternal life to whom you have given him. Note that there, you have given him authority. God has given Jesus authority. Jesus did not inherently already have this authority. God has this authority. Jesus is given it by God. And there's this hierarchy that's coming out here, that there is God and there is Jesus. Jesus is lower than God. God gives him things. God has the capacity to give this authority to Jesus. Jesus did not already have it, as one would expect if he was God. And this idea of God being the superior and giving to Jesus is something that comes out an awful lot through this chapter. So we have this hierarchy. These are not two equals. God gives to Jesus. Verse 3, and this eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. Notice that there. They know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. So again, at the end, you have sent Jesus, that hierarchy. But notice, God and Jesus are being treated as two completely separate things. They know you, the Father, that's how it began. They know you, the Father, as the only true God, and they know Jesus Christ. Two separate people. Jesus is not God. It's God and Jesus Christ. And notice also, God is knowable. They know you. They know the only true God. God is not an unknowable mystery that can never be understood. This is before the disciples have the gift of the Holy Spirit. Without the Holy Spirit, the disciples were capable of understanding and knowing the only true God and knowing Jesus Christ. Into verse 4, I glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you gave me to do. You gave me the work to do. Again, this idea, God gives things to Jesus to do. He gives him tasks to do, work to do. Jesus is not acting of his own volition in this. He's doing God's will. God is giving him things to do. They are not equals. On into verse 5, and now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed. So again, this idea of the Father, of God, giving things to Jesus. He gives him glory, or he's about to give him glory. So Jesus is saying, please give me this glory, glorify me. It's a thing that's about to happen. What's about to happen? Jesus is about to die on the cross, and in so doing, he's going to fulfill his purpose of living a sinless life and acting as a sacrificial lamb. And that is deserving of glory. So he's going to be given glory. He currently doesn't have that glory, otherwise he wouldn't be being given it. The glory, that existed beforehand, which is a strange concept. But bear in mind that God knows the future. God knows the end from the beginning. So God knew before the world existed that Jesus was going to succeed in his task. He was going to succeed in living a sinless life in accordance with God's will, and he was going to be worthy of this glory. So the glory that Jesus is about to be given existed before the world did, because God knew that Jesus deserved this glory even before the world existed, before Jesus existed, which is quite an interesting concept, but there you go. Verse 6, I have manifested your name to the people whom you gave me out of the world. Yours they were, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Again, the idea of giving is in that verse, but I've not really dwelt on it too much. Verse 7, now they know that everything that you have given me is from you. Everything that you've given me is from you. Everything Jesus has comes from God. Jesus is nothing without God. God has given him all this. And it just shows this relationship between them, that God is the superior. He gives, as the Father gives to a son, things to Jesus. He gives everything to Jesus. Jesus would not be anything without God's gifts. They're not the same. Verse 8, for I have given them the words that you gave me, and they received them and have come to know in truth that I came from you, and they have believed that you sent me. Now, here's an interesting one. We've been thinking about how God gives things to Jesus, and maybe you're thinking, well, the extent to which God gives to Jesus is just showing that Jesus is part of God, and that it's a very shared relationship they have. But notice that there, in terms of these words, I have given them the words that you gave me. So Jesus is given words by God, and then Jesus gives those words on again to the disciples. He's passed it on again. So it's not that this giving shows that they are the same being, because that would then mean the disciples were the same as Jesus. No, the disciples aren't the same as Jesus. He's passed these words on to them in the same way that God has passed them on to Jesus in the first place. It's this structure, this hierarchy is being established. There's God, then there's Jesus, and he's passing it on to the disciples. But they're not one and the same thing. They're separate. They're all separate people. So verse 8 there was, and they received them, and they've come to know in truth they came from you, and they believe that you sent me. Again, that same idea. Into verse 9, I am praying for them. Again, Jesus is praying, just to emphasize what we already knew from the start. I'm not praying for the world, but for those who you have given me. Again, this idea of Jesus being given things by God, for they are yours. Ultimately, it's God who has that supreme authority. In verse 10, all mine are yours, and yours are mine. I am glorified in them. Not a lot to say on that verse, so we'll carry on into verse 11, which says, and I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world. Okay, so there's an interesting idea there. I am no longer in the world, they are in the world, and I'm coming to you. So Jesus is not in the world. We're going to come back to that as a point, but just bear it in mind. Jesus is not in the world. Holy Father, keep them in your name, which you have given me, that they may be one, even as we are one. Let me just re-emphasize that point there. They may be one, even as we are one. The oneness that Jesus shares with God is the same as what the disciples can have with each other. That same level of oneness. So what does that mean? Well, the disciples clearly weren't one supreme being that was 12 beings in one. They were just 12 men. So how could they be one? And how could that compare to how Jesus and God are one? Well, the way that the disciples could be one is that they could have the same principles, the same ideals, the same thoughts, the same attitude to the world around them, the same characteristics, the same drive, the same focus, the same purpose. All of these things they can share, they can have in common. They can have all things in common in this way, and that helps them to act as one. It makes them act as one. They act as one body, all separate members, but all acting with one drive, one purpose. And it's the same as Jesus and God in that regard. Jesus and God can have the same purpose, the same drive, the same ideals, despite not being literally one, as in Jesus is not God, he just acts in the same way. The disciples are not the same as each other, they just act in the same way as each other. They just think in the same way as each other. They have that same drive, that they may be one, even as we are one. It's an attainable oneness. It's a oneness that can be shared between people. That's the oneness that Jesus and God have. It's a oneness that's achievable by people. It shows us Jesus is not God. Verse 12, while I was with them, I kept them in your name, which you've given me. I have guarded them, and not one of them has been lost except the son of destruction, that the scripture may be fulfilled. Nothing to say on that verse. But now I am coming to you, that these things I speak in the world, that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. Nice verses, but we're going to brush over them and carry on into verse 14. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. So we had there before Jesus not being of this world. The disciples are not of the world in the same way that Jesus is not of this world. Okay, so that helps us to understand this a bit more. It helps us to understand that Jesus not being of this world isn't that Jesus physically isn't of this world. That doesn't in and of itself mean that Jesus has descended from heaven into the world and as a baby, to become incarnate as a baby. They are not of the world in the same way. The disciples haven't descended from heaven. The disciples are not of this world because the disciples don't have the same ideals as the world around them. They don't have the same principles as the world around them. They've kept themselves separate from the world around them, just as Jesus, his thoughts weren't on the world around him. His thoughts were on higher things, heavenly things. Didn't mean that he was inherently in his nature heavenly at the time. In the same way, the disciples were not heavenly beings. They were merely not of this world, and they didn't share in the same ideals as the world around them. Verse 15, I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. Verse 16 repeats the same refrain. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Just as I'm not of the world. The same concept. Jesus has a very similar relationship to a lot of things as the disciples, and this includes his relationship with the world around him. Jesus is not of the world. The disciples are not of the world in the same way. The nature of the disciples and the nature of Jesus is the same in this way. The disciples are not God. The disciples are definitely not God. In the same way, Jesus is not God in this regard. Verse 17, sanctify them in truth. Your word is truth. Fine. Verse 18, as you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. Again, important point. So it's not just that the disciples aren't of the world in the same way that Jesus aren't of the world. They've been sent into the world in the same way that Jesus was sent into the world. AKA, not necessarily physically sent into the world. So the disciples, they already lived in the world. That's where they lived. That's where they were born. That's where they're from. Jesus is the same. He lived in the world. He was born in the world. That's where Jesus came to be. He was sent into the world because he hadn't acted in the way of the world around him. The disciples haven't been acting in the way of the world around them, but they're being sent into it to preach, to teach, to share the gospel. That's why Jesus was sent into the world, to teach, to preach, to share the gospel. It wasn't that he was sent physically into the world, in terms of he existed before and was sent into it as part of God. He was sent into the world to teach and to preach. The disciples are sent in the same way, to teach, to preach. Verse 19, and for their sake I consecrate myself, that they also may be sanctified in truth. Verse 20, I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, which I don't want to dwell on those verses particularly, but it is a nice little reference to us now today there, which is nice. And coming into verse 21, and this is a really important verse for these considerations, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. Let me read that again for you. That they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they may also be in us. The disciples, this oneness that they're sharing, it's not just with themselves, And now this disciples is including in that last verse more than just the 12 closest disciples. This is all believers in Jesus can have that same oneness, that it's not just that they have the same oneness that Jesus and God have, as in it's the same relationship, but it's included in the same. So they may have the same oneness, just as you, Father, are in me, I in you, that they may be in us. So this oneness now includes all of the disciples and Jesus and the Father. Does that mean the disciples are God? No. Does it mean that Jesus is God? No. This oneness is again, we've talked about it, this oneness of purpose and of ideals, of thoughts, of ways of looking at the world. All of these ideas, you know, your drive, your sense of character, your sense of right and wrong, all of these things they have in common. The disciples have them in common with each other and with Jesus and with God, which makes sense because the disciples are trying to be like Jesus and he is trying to be like God, and therefore they all have this same oneness of person, that they may be also may be in us. It's a shared thing. So we have the capacity to be part of God in the same way Jesus is part of God. That doesn't mean that we are God. It doesn't mean Jesus is God. Verse 22, the glory that you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one, even as we are one. The glory you've given me, I have given to them, that they may be one, even as we are one. I'm re-emphasizing that again. This oneness is something that disciples could obtain as well. The disciples have the capacity to be one as Jesus and God are one. The disciples are not God, Jesus is not God. And it includes this glory as well. We might have thought that Jesus being given glory shows that he is God, because only God is deserving of glory. But no, the disciples are also being given this glory. So this glory is again obtainable by someone who is definitely not God, because the disciples are not God. Verse 23, I in them and you in me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them even as you loved me. They can be perfectly one. This oneness that we've been talking about, it's not an imperfect one. It's not just like an example of oneness that maybe they could obtain, but really they're not going to obtain because it's not perfect. They can become perfectly one. You'd have thought that the perfect oneness that Jesus and God have, if you're thinking, well, that means that they are one being, the disciples have a perfect oneness, and they're not one being. The disciples aren't the same as each other. The disciples aren't God. The disciples are their own unique things. Jesus is not God. Jesus is the Son of God. And that love that is shared between Jesus and God, if you're thinking that the love that is between Jesus and God is so strong, and it is very, very strong, but is it so strong that they must be part of the same God? No, because that same love can be shared with the disciples as well. So it's not that the love itself defines God in this way. Final few verses. Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you have given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. There's not a great deal in here, but again, several verses or several passages, sub-passages in this passage, little sections that talk about how God has given things to Jesus, the glory that you have given me. It's again this idea that God passes things on to Jesus. God is both superior, they're not equal. God passes it on to Jesus. That's the hierarchical structure that we have. We looked at that earlier on in the chapter. It's coming back here at the end. Verse 25, O righteous Father, even though the world does not know you, I know you, and these know that you have sent me. Again, God has sent Jesus, and we've seen how Jesus then sends the disciples in the same way. It's the actions of a chain of people, not the actions of one being. And the final verse of the chapter, I have made known to them your name, and I will continue to make it known, that the love with which you have loved me may be in them, and I in them. So again, this love that is shared between God and Jesus, that same love can be shared with the disciples, and that is, of course, a lovely refrain. And so the chapter ends there. Chapter 18 goes on into the garden and into the betrayal and arrest of Jesus, and we're not going to go there. So let's sum up what we've seen from this chapter. The first thing to bring out really is that repeated refrain that came through in various different ways all the way through that chapter. God has given things to Jesus. He's given all things to Jesus. Jesus was given everything by God. Without God, Jesus would have had nothing. He had nothing before he was given it by God. The next thing to emphasize is the relationship between the disciples and the world, and how that's the same as Jesus's relationship with the world. The disciples are described as not of this world in the same way that Jesus is not of this world. He's not of this world. The disciples are not of this world because they do not have the same principles as the world around them. They act differently as the world. They keep themselves separate from the world. They're not of this world. It doesn't mean they are physically not of this world. And then when they're sent into the world, it doesn't mean that they are, okay, I mean, physically they do go into the world, but they're already in the world, they already live there. They're sent to go and preach to the world around them. Jesus was sent to preach and to teach. It doesn't necessarily mean in a physical way that Jesus was sent physically into the world. And that idea is sort of embellished a bit in that the disciples can share the same oneness with each other as Jesus has with the Father. And in fact, they can share that oneness as a complete oneness of the disciples and Jesus and the Father are all sharing that oneness together. It doesn't mean the disciples are God. They're sharing that same ideal set, that same purpose, the same drive, the same focus, the same characteristics, so that they're acting as one despite being separate. The disciples are not God. And in the same way, Jesus is not God. That's what this chapter has shown us.